"You're arresting the wrong man," the old woman whispered just as the handcuffs clicked louder than the Easter choir. For one impossible second, the entire church fell silent. The organ stopped mid-note. A little girl near the front pew tightened both hands around a white candle as melted wax dripped across her fingers. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows of St. Mark's Baptist Church, painting the marble floor in deep shades of blue, crimson, and gold. But the warmth of Easter morning vanished the moment Officer Daniel Mercer stepped down the center aisle with 3 uniformed officers behind him. Their black boots struck the stone floor in slow, echoing rhythm. Radio static crackled against the sound of distant rain outside. Father Elijah Brooks stood beside the altar in his white and gold Easter robe, one hand still resting on an open Bible. He was 52 years old, tall, calm, broad-shouldered, with silver beginning to touch the edges of his beard. For nearly 20 years, the people of South Chicago trusted him with their funerals, their children, their grief, and their last prayers. Now every eye inside the packed sanctuary locked onto the silver cuffs hanging from Officer Mercer's hand. "Father Elijah Brooks," Mercer announced loudly, his jaw tight beneath the fluorescent glow from the ceiling lights. "You are under arrest for fraud, obstruction, and unlawful confinement of a minor." Gasps rippled through the pews like a cold wind. Someone dropped a hymn book. A baby started crying near the back row. Father Elijah didn't move at first. He simply looked across the church at the frightened faces staring back at him. Elderly women frozen with trembling hands. Choir members still standing in powder blue robes. Children clutching Easter baskets filled with plastic eggs and candy. And near the front pew, 12-year-old Marcus Hill stared at the officers with wide, furious eyes. "That's a lie," Marcus blurted before his mother grabbed his arm. Mercer ignored him. His attention never left Elijah. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Outside, thunder rolled low over the city. Rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows. Father Elijah slowly closed the Bible in front of him. The soft thump echoed through the sanctuary. Then he stepped down from the altar with quiet dignity, the gold cross around his neck swaying gently against his robe. "Officers," he said calmly, his deep voice steady enough to settle half the room. "There's no need to frighten these people on Easter Sunday." Mercer's expression hardened. "Then cooperate." A younger officer shifted uncomfortably beside him, glancing toward the crying families in the pews. The smell of melted candle wax and fresh lilies hung heavy in the air. Father Elijah looked toward the choir loft where frightened children stood frozen beside the organ. Then he smiled softly. Not angry, not bitter, just tired. "Keep singing," he told them quietly. The choir director blinked in disbelief. "Father, keep singing," Elijah repeated. For a moment nobody moved. Then one trembling voice began the hymn again. Soft at first, barely above a whisper. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." More voices slowly joined in. The music rose gently beneath the sound of rain and police radios. Father Elijah turned and placed his hands behind his back without resistance. The metal cuffs closed around his wrists. Several people began crying openly now. Marcus stepped into the aisle, tears burning down his face. "He helped my brother when nobody else would," he shouted. "You can't do this." Mercer grabbed Elijah's arm firmly and guided him toward the center aisle. Cameras were already coming out. Phones lifted from every direction. The flashing screens reflected across the church windows like scattered lightning. Yet through all of it, Father Elijah never lowered his head. As officers escorted him toward the massive wooden doors of St. Mark's, he looked once more at his congregation standing beneath the stained glass and flickering Easter candles. And somehow, even in handcuffs, he still looked like the only man in the room who wasn't afraid. Rain streaked across the squad car windows in long silver lines as Father Elijah Brooks sat quietly in the back seat with his cuffed hands resting loosely in his lap. Red and blue lights reflected across the wet Chicago streets while Easter banners fluttered under the storm outside. Officer Daniel Mercer drove without speaking, his jaw locked tight, one hand gripping the steering wheel hard enough for the veins in his wrist to rise beneath his pale skin. The radio crackled every few seconds with dispatch chatter and distant sirens, but inside the vehicle, the silence felt heavier than the rain. Father Elijah looked out the window as they passed rows of brick apartment buildings, corner grocery stores, and families still carrying Easter flowers beneath umbrellas. Some people recognized the church robe immediately. Faces turned. Phones lifted. One woman standing beneath a bus stop cover slowly removed her hand from her mouth in disbelief as the police car rolled past. In the front passenger seat, Officer Tyler Reed shifted uneasily. He was younger than Mercer by nearly 15 years and had barely looked at Elijah since the arrest. Finally, he cleared his throat softly. "Sir," he said quietly, glancing back for only a second. "Do you need medical attention or anything?" Mercer shot him a sharp look before Elijah could answer. "He is fine." But Elijah nodded politely toward Tyler anyway. "Thank you, officer. I am all right." His calm voice somehow made the silence worse. Mercer exhaled through his nose and turned sharply onto Madison Avenue. "You know," he muttered, eyes fixed on the road. "Most guilty people at least try defending themselves." Elijah watched rainwater slide down the glass beside him. "And most angry people," he replied gently, "already decided what they want to believe." Tyler lowered his eyes. Mercer gave a humorless laugh. "Spare me the sermon." Outside, church bells echoed faintly through the storm as Easter service ended across the city. The sound lingered for a moment before fading beneath the hum of traffic. 20 minutes later, the squad car pulled behind the 12th District Precinct. Gray concrete walls towered beneath flickering floodlights while cold rain hammered against dumpsters near the alley gate. Elijah stepped carefully from the car, his white robe dampening instantly beneath the drizzle. Reporters were already gathering behind the barricades out front. Camera flashes exploded against the dark afternoon sky. "Father Brooks, did you hide the missing boy? Did church donations fund the safe house? Are more arrests coming?" Mercer guided Elijah toward the rear entrance while officers held back the growing crowd. Tyler hesitated near the door as shouting reporters pressed against metal barriers. "This is getting out of control," he murmured under his breath. Mercer ignored him completely. Inside the precinct, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a faint electrical hum. The building smelled like burnt coffee, wet jackets, and old paperwork. Detectives glanced up from their desks as Elijah entered, still wearing his Easter robe and silver cross. Some stared openly. Others quietly looked away. A secretary near the front desk stopped typing altogether. "That is him," she whispered. Mercer handed paperwork onto the booking counter. "Fraud investigation tied to St. Mark's Outreach Housing Program," he said firmly. "Possible unlawful concealment of a minor." Elijah stood silently while another officer removed the cuffs. Red marks lined his wrists, but he rubbed them only once before folding his hands calmly in front of him. Detective Laura Bennett emerged from a nearby office carrying a thick manila folder beneath her arm. Mid-40s, sharp-eyed, exhausted from years in homicide. She slowed the moment she recognized Elijah. "Father Brooks," she said carefully, "you are involved in this." Mercer answered before Elijah could speak. "We found evidence linking him to a runaway juvenile connected to the church basement housing network." Laura studied Elijah's face for several long seconds. Rain tapped softly against the precinct windows behind them. "Does not sound like him," she said quietly. Mercer's expression darkened immediately. Evidence does not care what sounds right. But Laura did not answer him. Her eyes remained fixed on Elijah, who stood soaking wet beneath the harsh fluorescent lights with the dignity of a man carrying something far heavier than handcuffs. The rain had not stopped by nightfall. Water rolled down the tall precinct windows while the city outside dissolved into red brake lights and blurred reflections across wet pavement. Inside interview room 3, Father Elijah Brooks sat alone at a small metal table beneath a flickering fluorescent bulb that hummed softly overhead. His damp, white robe had begun to wrinkle near the sleeves, and tiny drops of rainwater still clung to the silver cross resting against his chest. A paper cup of untouched coffee cooled beside him. Beyond the one-way mirror, Officer Daniel Mercer stood with folded arms while Detective Laura Bennett flipped slowly through the thick folder in her hands. Surveillance photos, financial records, copies of donation receipts from St. Mark's Community Shelter. Laura frowned deeper with every page. "Something feels wrong here," she said quietly. Mercer leaned against the wall. "You always say that before a clean arrest." "No," Laura replied without looking up. "I say that when somebody wants a headline more than the truth." Mercer's jaw tightened immediately. Through the glass, Elijah remained perfectly still, his hands folded calmly on the table like a man waiting for a prayer instead of an interrogation. Laura watched him for another moment. "You know I grew up 2 blocks from St. Mark's?" she asked softly. Mercer gave a short shrug. "Then you know how good these church guys are at fooling people." Laura closed the folder harder than necessary. "He buried my father when nobody else showed up." The room fell silent except for distant ringing phones deeper inside the precinct. Mercer finally pushed himself away from the wall. "This is not about your childhood memories. We have testimony that he hid a runaway teenager in church property without reporting it." "A runaway," Laura repeated carefully. "Or a kid hiding from abuse." Mercer looked at her coldly. "That is not his decision to make." Across the bullpen, televisions mounted above the desks suddenly shifted to breaking news coverage. Reporters stood outside St. Mark's Baptist Church beneath umbrellas while footage from the arrest replayed across the screen. The image of Father Elijah in handcuffs walking through Easter candles flashed over and over beneath bold red headlines. Officers throughout the station slowed to watch. Some shook their heads quietly. Others muttered under their breath. One older desk sergeant lowered his reading glasses and stared at the screen for several long seconds. "That preacher fed my nephew for 6 months after my sister lost her apartment," he murmured quietly. Mercer ignored him and opened the interview room door. The fluorescent light spilled across Elijah's face as Mercer entered carrying the folder beneath one arm. Laura remained near the doorway. Elijah looked up calmly. "Detective Bennett," he said softly, recognizing her. Laura nodded once. "Father." Mercer dropped the folder onto the metal table. Papers spread slightly across the surface. "Let us stop pretending," he said sharply. "Where is Isaiah Cole?" Elijah's eyes lowered briefly toward the scattered paperwork. "Safe." Mercer leaned forward immediately. "So you admit you concealed him?" "I protected him," Elijah answered quietly. "There is a difference." Mercer laughed once without humor. "From his own father?" Elijah looked directly at him for the first time since entering the station. There was no anger in his expression, only exhaustion. Sometimes a child runs from the place adults keep sending him back to. The room grew still again. Rain tapped steadily against the building outside. Laura noticed Tyler Reed standing silently near the hallway now, listening from a distance with unease written across his face. Mercer opened another document from the folder. "You transferred church funds into a housing account connected to the shelter basement." "Food," Elijah corrected gently. "Blankets. Medicine during winter." Mercer slapped the paper back onto the table harder this time. "You expect me to believe you are running a charity operation under church property without hiding anything illegal?" Elijah glanced briefly toward the rain-covered window behind Mercer. "Officer," he said softly, "you walked into God's house on Easter morning already convinced I was guilty." Mercer's face darkened. "Because men like you always hide behind faith." Laura's eyes lifted immediately toward him. The words hung in the room heavier than the storm outside. Even Tyler shifted uncomfortably in the hallway. Elijah remained silent for several seconds. Then he spoke so quietly the room almost missed it. "No," he said. "Men like me bury children this city forgets." The clock above the bullpen read 11:47 p.m. when the first crack appeared in Officer Daniel Mercer's perfect case. Rain still battered the precinct windows while exhausted detectives shuffled through paperwork beneath the harsh fluorescent glow. Empty coffee cups crowded desks. Television screens replayed the Easter arrest on an endless loop, while social media numbers climbed in the corner of every broadcast. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. Protest footage had already begun gathering outside St. Mark's Baptist Church despite the storm. Inside interview room 3, Father Elijah Brooks remained seated quietly at the metal table. Someone had finally brought him a dry blanket from the holding area, folded neatly across the back of his chair. He had not asked for it. Detective Laura Bennett sat across from him now, reading carefully through another stack of documents tied to St. Mark's outreach program. Shelter expenses, grocery receipts, winter coat drives, prescription reimbursements. Nothing looked unusual. In fact, everything looked painfully organized. "You keep records better than half the city agencies I investigate," Laura admitted quietly. Elijah managed a faint, tired smile. "Poor communities learn quickly that nobody gives them the benefit of the doubt." Laura glanced up at him. The fluorescent light reflected softly against the silver in his beard. "Why did the boy trust you enough to run to your church?" Elijah looked toward the rain-streaked window beside the table, because he knew nobody there would hit him for being afraid. The words settled heavily into the room. Laura lowered her eyes back to the paperwork without responding. Outside the interview room, Tyler Reed stood frozen near a desk monitor. His face had gone pale beneath the overhead lights. "Detective," he called suddenly. Laura stepped into the bullpen while Tyler pointed shakily at the screen in front of him. "You need to see this." Security footage filled the monitor from 3 nights earlier. Grainy black and white video from outside St. Mark's rear shelter entrance showed a thin teenage boy wearing a soaked hoodie standing beside Father Elijah beneath the church awning. The timestamp flashed 1:12 a.m. The boy looked terrified, arms wrapped tightly around himself against the cold rain. Elijah placed a blanket gently around his shoulders before leading him carefully inside. Tyler swallowed hard. "This is the footage Mercer logged as unlawful concealment." Laura narrowed her eyes. "Where is the threat?" Tyler hesitated. "There is more." He clicked another file open. This one came from a bodycam review partially flagged during evidence upload. The footage jittered slightly beneath streetlights. Officer Mercer stood outside the church alley speaking with another patrol officer before the arrest warrant had been approved. "We finally got him," Mercer's recorded voice said through static. "People trust these church heroes too much." The second officer sounded uncertain. But internal services said the abuse complaint against the father is still under review. Mercer shrugged on camera. "The kid belongs at home, not hidden in some basement run by Brooks." Tyler stopped the footage. Silence swallowed the bullpen. Phones rang somewhere in the distance. Rain hammered harder against the windows. Laura stared at the frozen frame of Mercer's face illuminated by red patrol lights. "He knew," she whispered. Tyler nodded slowly. The father filed no missing child report until nearly 18 hours later, and Child Protective Services already had 2 open investigations. Laura exhaled sharply and grabbed the case folder beneath her arm. Across the room, Mercer emerged from Captain Howard Reeves's office carrying another stack of paperwork. He stopped the moment he saw Laura's expression. "What?" he asked flatly. Laura walked directly toward him, holding the tablet screen up. "You withheld active abuse investigations from your affidavit." Mercer's face hardened instantly. "That does not change the kidnapping. The boy ran to a church for protection," Laura snapped quietly. "And you omitted evidence that supported why." Several nearby officers stopped pretending not to listen. The room suddenly felt smaller beneath the fluorescent lights. Mercer lowered his voice carefully. "You are overreacting." "No," Laura replied, eyes locked on his. "I think you arrested a respected black pastor on Easter Sunday before verifying half your own case." Mercer's jaw tightened. "Careful, detective." But before Laura could answer, another voice interrupted from the television overhead. "Breaking tonight," the anchor announced urgently. "New eyewitnesses are now coming forward regarding the arrest of Father Elijah Brooks after a minor connected to the case allegedly contacted a local journalist just moments ago." Every officer in the bullpen turned toward the screen at once. And for the first time all night, Daniel Mercer looked uncertain. The television glow washed pale blue light across the entire precinct as every officer stared upward in stunned silence. Rain rattled against the windows while the news anchor pressed one hand against an earpiece, her voice tightening with urgency. "We are receiving this footage live from an undisclosed location," she announced. "The teenager connected to the investigation involving St. Mark's Baptist Church has just spoken publicly for the first time." The screen shifted suddenly to shaky cell phone video. A frightened teenage boy appeared wrapped in an oversized gray hoodie beneath dim apartment lighting. His face looked exhausted, eyes swollen from lack of sleep, but his voice remained steady enough to cut through the silence of the bullpen. "My name is Isaiah Cole," he said quietly. "Father Elijah did not kidnap me. He saved me." Nobody in the precinct moved. Even the ringing phones seemed distant now. Isaiah swallowed hard before continuing. "I ran away because I was scared to go home. Father Elijah let me sleep in the church basement because I did not have nowhere else to go. He told me every day that I should speak to social workers and stay safe." Laura Bennett slowly lowered the case folder in her hands. Across the room, Tyler Reed stared at the monitor without blinking. But Officer Daniel Mercer looked frozen, completely still, his face draining of color beneath the fluorescent lights. On the television, Isaiah's hands trembled slightly as he held the phone. "The police came to St. Mark's before Easter," he continued. I heard Officer Mercer tell Father Elijah that people like him always think they are above the law. Father Elijah asked him to leave because kids were sleeping downstairs. The newsroom audio crackled briefly. Then Isaiah looked directly into the camera. He never hurt nobody. He fed us. He prayed with us. He made us feel safe. The video ended abruptly. Silence crashed over the precinct harder than the storm outside. Captain Howard Reeves stepped slowly from his office near the back hallway, his face grim beneath the overhead lights. "My office," he said sharply to Mercer. No one missed the shift in his voice. Mercer opened his mouth once as if searching for an explanation, but none came. Reeves turned toward Laura next. "Detective Bennett, read. Bring every file tied to this case." Mercer followed the captain down the hallway while officers quietly avoided looking at him. The bullpen no longer felt supportive. It felt watchful, suspicious, cold. Inside interview room 3, Father Elijah sat alone, unaware of the television footage spreading across every major network in the country. Rainwater still traced thin lines down the narrow window beside him, while the untouched coffee had gone completely cold. Laura entered slowly, carrying the updated case file against her chest. For a moment, she simply stood there looking at him beneath the humming fluorescent bulb. "Isaiah spoke publicly," she said finally. Elijah closed his eyes briefly with visible relief. "Thank God." Laura pulled out the metal chair opposite him. "You knew he would eventually." Elijah nodded faintly. "Fear can silence people for only so long." Laura studied him carefully. "You protected him knowing it could cost you everything." Elijah looked down at the silver cross resting against his damp robe. "Children do not measure safety the same way adults measure risk." Outside the room, raised voices suddenly echoed through the hallway. Captain Reeves's office door slammed hard enough to shake nearby desks. Officers throughout the bullpen exchanged nervous looks while television anchors repeated Isaiah's statement again and again. Social media numbers exploded across every screen. Protesters outside St. Mark's had doubled despite the rain. Some carried candles beneath umbrellas. Others held signs demanding Elijah's release. Tyler Reed stood near the hallway gripping a printed report with trembling fingers. The bodycam footage review had now expanded. More missing timestamps. More omitted notes. More evidence quietly removed before the arrest warrant reached the judge. Tyler looked sick. Across the station, one older officer muttered softly beneath his breath, "Mercer just destroyed his career." But another officer answered quietly while staring at Father Elijah through the interview room glass. "No," he said. "He destroyed people's trust." Deep thunder rolled across the city outside. And for the first time since the Easter service began that morning, the power inside the room had finally started to shift. By 2:30 in the morning, the storm over Chicago had finally begun to weaken. Rain no longer hammered the precinct windows. Instead, soft droplets slid quietly down the glass beneath the pale orange glow of streetlights outside. The chaos inside the station had faded into a tense, exhausted silence. Television anchors still discussed the case in low, urgent voices, but now even the reporters sounded uncertain, careful, aware that the story had started turning against the police department itself. Inside Captain Howard Reeves's office, nobody raised their voice anymore. That somehow made the room feel worse. Reeves stood near the darkened window with both hands pressed against his hips while internal affairs investigators reviewed bodycam timestamps across multiple screens. Officer Daniel Mercer sat rigidly in a chair near the conference table, his untouched coffee growing cold beside him. The confidence that had carried him through the Easter arrest earlier that day was gone now. In its place sat something heavier, something closer to fear. "You deliberately withheld Child Protective Services documentation," one investigator said flatly while scrolling through digital files. Mercer rubbed both hands slowly across his face. "I was trying to protect the boy by arresting the one person sheltering him." Mercer looked away without answering. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly. Outside the office windows, the city looked washed clean beneath the rain. Meanwhile, in interview room 3, Father Elijah Brooks remained alone. The room felt colder now that the building had quieted. He sat with the blanket folded across his lap, elbows resting gently on the metal table, eyes lowered toward the small Bible someone had finally returned to him from personal property. The silver-edged pages reflected faint light beneath the flickering bulb overhead. A young officer approached cautiously outside the room, carrying another cup of coffee. Tyler Reed. He hesitated before opening the door. Father. Elijah looked up softly. Tyler entered awkwardly, setting the warm cup onto the table. Fresh coffee this time, he said quietly. Elijah smiled faintly. Thank you, Officer Reed. Tyler remained standing near the doorway for several seconds, unsure whether to leave. Finally, he spoke again. I watched the Easter service live stream before we got there. Elijah listened silently. Tyler swallowed hard. My mother used to take me to church every Sunday when I was a kid. St. Matthew's over on West Monroe. His eyes drifted briefly toward the floor. She died 3 years ago. Elijah closed the Bible gently. I am sorry. Tyler nodded once. She used to say you can tell who a person really is by how they act when people stop treating them fairly. The words lingered quietly between them. Tyler glanced up at Elijah sitting beneath the cold fluorescent light, still calm after everything that had happened. Most people would be screaming at us right now. Elijah looked toward the rain slipping slowly down the narrow window. Pain makes people loud sometimes, he answered softly. But dignity does not always need volume. Tyler looked away quickly as emotion tightened unexpectedly across his face. Somewhere deeper inside the station, a phone rang twice before stopping again. The city outside felt distant now. Slower. Tired. For what it is worth, Tyler said quietly, I think we got this wrong. Elijah studied the young officer for a moment before speaking. Then do not waste time defending your pride, he replied gently. Use your energy defending the truth. Tyler nodded slowly. His shoulders seemed lighter somehow as he stepped back toward the door. Before leaving, he paused once more. There are people outside praying for you, he said. Elijah's tired eyes softened slightly. Then I am not alone. Tyler exited quietly, leaving the door cracked open behind him. Beyond the hallway window near the bullpen, candlelight flickered faintly across the wet street outside the precinct. Dozens of people stood beneath umbrellas in complete silence holding candles against the cold night air. No shouting, no anger, just quiet prayer beneath the fading rain. And inside the station, more than one officer suddenly found it difficult to meet their own reflection in the glass. At 6:14 the next morning, the sun finally broke through the clouds above Chicago. Pale gold lights spilled across rain-soaked streets, flashing against puddles and police barricades outside the 12th District Precinct. The candlelight vigil had never fully disappeared during the night. Some people had gone home, but others remained standing quietly beneath heavy coats with coffee cups warming their hands. Church women whispered prayers beneath umbrellas. Teenagers from St. Mark's passed out muffins and blankets to strangers. Reporters lined the sidewalks beside satellite trucks, their voices sharp with exhaustion after hours of nonstop coverage. Inside the station, the mood had changed completely. Nobody moved with confidence anymore. Officers spoke in low voices. Desks once filled with casual conversation now felt tense beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Television screens replayed new footage every 15 minutes. More witnesses had stepped forward overnight. Former shelter volunteers, social workers, parents from the neighborhood. Every interview painted the same picture of Father Elijah Brooks. Patient, honest, protective. Meanwhile, internal affairs investigators continued pulling files directly from department servers. And every file led deeper into Daniel Mercer's decisions. Captain Howard Reeves stood near the bullpen monitor reading the newest report with growing disbelief. Missing timestamps had expanded into altered statements. Witness notes had been omitted entirely. One affidavit line regarding Child Protective Services had been rewritten before reaching the judge who signed the warrant. Reeves lowered the folder slowly. Dear God, he muttered beneath his breath. Across the room, Mercer sat alone at his desk staring blankly at a dark computer monitor. He had not removed his jacket all night. His eyes looked hollow now, the sharp certainty that once defined him replaced by something restless and frightened. Every few minutes, another officer walked past without speaking to him. Nobody offered support anymore. Nobody asked if he was all right. Tyler Reed approached carefully, carrying another stack of printed transcripts from overnight witness interviews. He stopped beside Mercer's desk without sitting down. They found the original bodycam upload, Tyler said quietly. Mercer looked up slowly. And Tyler swallowed once. The deleted section recovered automatically from cloud backup. Mercer's face tightened immediately. You should not be discussing this with me. Tyler stared at him for several long seconds. You knew that boy was hiding from abuse, he said softly. Mercer stood abruptly, his chair scraping hard against the floor. Several nearby officers glanced over immediately. You think you understand this city? Mercer snapped under his breath. You think these neighborhoods survive because pastors hand out soup and prayers? Tyler did not move. No, he answered quietly. I think they survive because people like Father Elijah show up when nobody else does. The silence afterward felt brutal. Mercer looked away first. Inside interview room 3, sunlight finally reached the narrow window for the first time since Elijah arrived the day before. Warm light spread softly across the metal table, an open Bible resting beneath his folded hands. Detective Laura Bennett entered carrying a fresh set of paperwork and paused briefly at the doorway. Elijah looked calmer this morning somehow, despite the exhaustion beneath his eyes. You should have a lawyer here soon, Laura told him. Elijah nodded faintly. And Isaiah? Safe. A quiet breath of relief escaped him. Laura hesitated before speaking again. Internal Affairs is recommending suspension orders before noon. Elijah lowered his eyes briefly. For Officer Mercer? Laura nodded once. Possibly more than suspension. Elijah remained silent for several moments while sunlight reflected softly across the silver cross resting against his chest. Finally he spoke. I never wanted anyone ruined. Laura looked at him almost incredulously. After what they did to you? Elijah lifted his eyes toward the glowing window. Outside, church bells somewhere across the city rang softly through the morning air. Easter Monday. A new day beginning over wet streets and tired buildings. Bitterness spreads faster than mercy, he said quietly. That is how communities break apart. Laura studied him in complete silence. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, she realized something that unsettled her more than the arrest itself. Even now, with his reputation dragged through every television screen in America, Father Elijah Brooks still seemed more concerned about the souls of the people who accused him than his own freedom. By late afternoon, the city no longer debated whether Father Elijah Brooks was innocent. The only question left was how the police department had allowed the arrest to happen at all. News helicopters circled above the 12th District Precinct, while reporters crowded the sidewalks shoulder to shoulder beneath bright station umbrellas. Camera flashes exploded every few seconds against wet pavement, still glistening from the night storm. Protest signs mixed with church candles outside the barricades. Some people sang hymns softly beneath the cold spring wind. Others simply stood in silence, holding photographs of Father Elijah serving meals at shelters and baptizing children at St. Mark's over the years. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere had collapsed completely. Internal Affairs investigators moved from desk to desk collecting evidence boxes, while officers avoided eye contact whenever Daniel Mercer passed through the bullpen. His badge and service weapon had already been surrendered that morning. By 3 o'clock, suspension paperwork became termination paperwork. Captain Howard Reeves signed the final documents with a face that looked 10 years older than the day before. Mercer stood stiffly across the desk while rain clouds drifted slowly beyond the office window. You embarrassed this department, Reeves said quietly. Mercer gave a bitter laugh under his breath. That pastor embarrassed us the moment he turned the city against cops. Reeves looked at him carefully for several long seconds. No, he replied. You did that yourself. The silence afterward felt final. Mercer lowered his eyes toward the signed papers sitting on the desk. His career, 22 years in uniform, ended beneath the scratch of a pen and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Across the station, Detective Laura Bennett entered interview room 3 carrying release documents. Sunlight now filled the room completely, warming the gray walls and metal table where Father Elijah had spent nearly 24 hours. Laura placed the paperwork gently in front of him. You are free to go, she said softly. Elijah looked down at the papers without touching them immediately. And Isaiah? Placed with emergency protective services this morning. A tired breath escaped Elijah's chest. Good. Laura hesitated before speaking again. The city plans to issue a public apology. Elijah finally lifted his eyes toward her. An apology does not repair fear. Laura nodded slowly because she knew he was right. Outside the precinct entrance, the crowd stirred the moment word spread that Father Elijah would be released. Television crews rushed toward the barricades while church members pressed hands over their mouths in relief. Marcus Hill stood near the front clutching a handmade cardboard sign bent slightly from rainwater. Mrs. Clara Jenkins held his shoulder tightly as tears filled her tired eyes. Then the precinct doors opened. Conversation across the entire street faded almost instantly. Father Elijah stepped outside wearing the same white Easter robe now slightly wrinkled from the long night inside custody. The silver cross rested calmly against his chest beneath the fading afternoon light. For one quiet moment nobody moved. Cameras lowered. Reporters stopped shouting questions. Even traffic beyond the barricades seemed distant. Then Marcus broke free from the crowd and ran forward. Father Elijah. The boy threw his arms around him without hesitation. Elijah smiled softly and embraced him carefully while church bells somewhere in the distance began ringing across the city again. Several people in the crowd started crying openly. Others bowed their heads in prayer. Laura Bennett watched from the precinct doorway beside Tyler Reed, while reporters captured every second live across national television. But farther back near the edge of the sidewalk stood Daniel Mercer alone without his uniform. No badge, no authority, just a tired middle-aged man in a wrinkled dress shirt staring at the community he once believed feared him. He looked at Father Elijah surrounded by people who genuinely loved him, and something inside Mercer finally seemed to crack beneath the weight of everything he had destroyed. Slowly, almost uncertainly, he stepped forward through the crowd until he stood only a few feet away. The city cameras turned toward him instantly. Mercer swallowed hard, unable to meet Elijah's eyes at first. The spring wind lifted loose pages of newspapers across the sidewalk between them. Finally, in front of the entire city, Mercer spoke quietly enough that the nearest microphones barely caught it. "I was wrong." Father Elijah looked at him silently for several seconds. Then, to the shock of everyone watching, he stepped closer and gently placed one hand against Mercer's shoulder. Not anger, not triumph, just mercy, and somehow that felt heavier than punishment. 1 week later, St. Mark's Baptist Church was fuller than anyone had seen in years. Every pew overflowed with families dressed in soft spring colors, while sunlight streamed through the tall stained glass windows in ribbons of gold, blue, and crimson. The storm that had covered Chicago the previous Easter weekend was gone now. Outside, the sidewalks still carried traces of rain stains near the curbs, but warm April wind moved gently through the city carrying the smell of fresh bread from nearby bakeries and damp earth from the church garden. Inside the sanctuary, the choir sang softly beneath the glow of hanging chandeliers while children whispered and shifted beside their parents clutching hymn books too large for their hands. Some people had arrived 2 hours early just to find standing room. Reporters waited quietly near the back rows with lowered cameras this time. No shouting, no flashing lights, only silence and respect. Near the front pew sat Isaiah Cole beside a social worker and 2 foster parents approved earlier that week. For the first time since anyone could remember, the teenager looked rested. His shoulders no longer curled inward defensively. A small Bible rested in his lap, unopened but carefully held. Across the aisle, Detective Laura Bennett sat quietly in plain clothes while Tyler Reed stood near the back wall beside several officers from the 12th District. None of them wore uniforms today. None of them wanted the attention. At exactly 11 o'clock, the sanctuary doors opened softly. Conversation faded almost instantly. Father Elijah Brooks stepped inside wearing a simple dark suit instead of his ceremonial robe. The silver cross still rested against his chest, catching small flashes of sunlight as he walked slowly down the aisle. People rose to their feet without anyone asking them to. Not cheering, not shouting, just standing together in complete silence. The sound of wooden pews creaking echoed gently through the church, while tears quietly filled more than a few eyes. Elijah paused briefly near the middle aisle where Mrs. Clara Jenkins reached out and squeezed his hand tightly with trembling fingers. Marcus Hill stood beside her grinning so hard he could barely contain himself. Father Elijah smiled softly back before continuing toward the pulpit. Outside the church, a lone figure remained near the far sidewalk beneath a blooming maple tree. Daniel Mercer. He wore no badge now, no gun, no authority hanging from his shoulders. Just a gray coat and tired eyes fixed quietly on the stained glass windows glowing beneath the morning sun. Cars rolled slowly past him while distant church bells echoed across South Chicago. Mercer never stepped inside. He simply stood there listening to the muffled choir through the open church doors, hands buried deep in his pockets against the cool breeze. Inside the sanctuary, Father Elijah reached the pulpit and slowly opened his Bible. The pages whispered softly beneath his fingers. Sunlight stretched across the wooden floor behind him while the entire congregation waited. For several moments he said nothing at all. No dramatic speech. No anger. No discussion about the arrest or the humiliation or the television cameras that had broadcast his pain across the country. He simply looked out at the faces before him. Families, teenagers, elderly couples, police officers, children, broken people trying their best to heal. Then finally he spoke in the same calm voice that had steadied frightened souls inside hospital rooms, shelters, and funerals for nearly 20 years. Sometimes, he said quietly, the hardest thing a person will ever do is choose not to become cruel after being hurt. The sanctuary remained perfectly still. Somewhere outside, wind rustled through the maple leaves near the sidewalk, where Mercer stood alone listening with lowered eyes. Father Elijah closed the Bible gently. No music followed. No applause came. Only silence filled the church beneath the colored light from the stained glass windows. And somehow, in that silence, justice finally felt complete.